Okay. Okay, so I'm gonna share my screen because that's where I have my slides. So sharing this. And okay, so can somebody just confirm verbally for me, because I can't see anybody anymore, that you see just one slide with the title Landscapes as Cultural Phenomena?
I can see it.
Yes.
Okay, thank you so much. Alrighty, so once again, hello and thank you everybody for joining me for this first ever web-based workshop hosted by RESES, or Rhizome Eco-Social Education Society. For those of you who may not know, we're a newly formed nonprofit organization, and we're based out of Kelowna, BC. And our mission is to empower individuals and communities by creating inclusive and accessible ecological education programming and also demonstration projects. So as a tool for teaching ecological design, we use something called permaculture, which is an approach to design based on how natural ecosystems function. So once again, my name is Lucie Bardos, and my role with RESES is as a project lead, and I'm also one of the co-founders. And so I wanted to welcome everybody to this workshop today, which is entitled Landscapes as Cultural Phenomena. And I think that this workshop is great for anyone who's interested in permaculture, landscape design, or just in general, growing a respectful and meaningful relationship with their surrounding landscapes. It was originally presented to the students of the Eco Landscape Mastery Program, which is hosted by Eric Olson, who is from the Permaculture Skills Center in California. But I thought it would actually be a really good fit for a RESES workshop as well. And the image that you see on the slide is of pre-colonial Tenochtitlan, Mexico, which is also known as Mexico City these days. And I'm not going to dive into what this image means so much right now, but I'm just going to let you sit with it for a while, and then we're going to return to it during the workshop. So before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that I'm currently living and working on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded Syilx Okanagan territory, which occupies actually a sizable chunk of not only southern BC, but also northern Washington. And I'm also conscious of the fact that today I'm speaking to you as a settler living on Indigenous territory, and I'm speaking about my own experiences, journeys, and background. So in no way do I want to say that I'm speaking from like a general perspective, and in no way do I want to be prescriptive, or I don't want it to sound like what I'm sharing with you is what everybody should do or think. It's quite a personal webinar and a personal subjective perspective. And I also wanted to say that I'm not really here to teach anybody anything, but I kind of want to spark conversation or thought and just share some ideas that I think could be interesting or important, especially within like a land relationship and permaculture context. So this presentation is about relationships to land, and that's pretty personal to me. It also draws a lot on my academic background and my life experiences. So before I get into the nitty-gritty, I wanted to share a few words about myself to begin with. So I was born in Slovakia in Eastern Europe, but I was raised in Vancouver, Canada from the age of 5. Back in Slovakia, my grandparents have this cottage in the hills, and it's always been my favorite childhood place to return to. My grandma, so the picture at the bottom middle is me and my sister, who's also presenting later today with my grandma. My grandma at our cottage, she would grow these giant zucchinis, but there were also gooseberry bushes and elderberries kind of growing wild all around the property. There was a semi-untended apple and pear orchard in the back. And as a kid, I would just kind of lose myself in the tall grass and my imaginary world at that place. And so being close to the land is always where I felt at home and like myself. And I've always been drawn to a land-based life. And I often feel stifled and anxious when I'm living in cities. So a land relationship is always something that's been part of my own journey from a very young age. So I first heard about this thing called permaculture in an undergraduate biology class at the University of BC, and the class was called Plants and Peoples. And so for anybody who may not know, permaculture, or I'll also be referring to it as ecological design, is a way of designing and analyzing human sustaining systems using ecosystems as a reference point and as a model. It leads you through a series of design steps to help you create a project, which could be a garden, a farm, a home, even an organization or a business that has resilience and mirrors the interconnectedness of an ecosystem. Many people refer to it as designing with nature for a shorthand. So back in this biology class, one of my classmates did a permaculture design for her downtown Vancouver condo, where she convinced her building manager to allow her to turn some of the green space around the condo into an edible landscape. And she also figured out these really cool ways to grow plants on a small balcony and how to incorporate plants into an indoor garden as well. I then discovered that permaculture had all these different branches and applications, and I was pretty much hooked from that point on. In the years following that, I've taken many workshops and courses with teachers like Toby Hemingway, Luby McNamara, Delvin Silkinson, Heather Jo Flores, and others. And I've had the chance to participate in permaculture work groups, convergences, and work with different permaculture teachers as part of the permaculture teachers community. I have my permaculture design certificate, also called a PDC, and I also have a natural building certificate, and I'm currently on the faculty of the Permaculture Women's Guild online PDC. As I mentioned, I'm a co-founder of RESES, together with Victor, my husband, Alana Westers, and Haruko Kagami, which is also joining us on this workshop. And for my day job, I work as a community project consultant, these days mostly with the Okanagan Fruit Tree Project Society, which is a food security-based organization that rescues produce that would otherwise go to waste and donates it to nonprofits and schools around the Okanagan, as well as other projects. So as much as I feel at home with my hands in the dirt, I have developed a very special fondness for the social dimensions of permaculture, such as alternative economic structures, emotional permaculture, community building, and cross-pollination with local social issues. In 2015, I completed a master's degree at Lund University in Sweden on the social dimensions of sustainability. And I realized that I often felt like this theme, the social part of sustainability, was not explored in enough detail in many permaculture courses that I took, or just in general. And I'm always interested in edge topics, like topics that are kind of on the edge of a subject, that are like just beginning to creep into it. So I really dove into that side of things. I'm sorry if this was a wordy intro, but I think it explains why I'm drawn to the kind of social dimensions of landscapes and understanding this human landscape connection. So with all of that being said, let's move into the goals of what this webinar is and what I would like to communicate through this presentation. So for this webinar, I have two broad goals. The first one is to discuss some historical case studies that illustrate how landscapes are a cultural phenomenon. And then secondly, to explore what it means to create relationships with instead of on landscapes in a way that recognizes the histories and stories already woven into those landscapes. And as I mentioned before, my goals are not to teach you any particular thing, but to open up a discussion on some topics that I think are sometimes glossed over in educational spaces, including permaculture design. And also in my own, education as a young person growing up, these topics were often not discussed. So as I mentioned, I'm going to be drawing on my own research and educational background because I always find it most engaging when educators use topics that they have like a personal interest in or familiarity with to illustrate broader concepts. So going back to my university days, I've always had a personal interest in this relationship between land and human societies. And I've also always been interested in many topics at the same time. This is just how my brain works. So during my undergraduate degree, I pursued classes in human geography, Latin American studies, and conservation biology all at the same time. So while on the surface, these may seem kind of different, they actually help to paint a picture of the tensions that exist between nature conservation and social struggles as they relate to land and landscapes. So the picture that you see in this slide is Yosemite Park, which was created in the 1864 Yosemite Grant Act. And something I learned in my studies was that the national parks movement in the US really perpetuated this image of like a wild, untamed nature that needs protecting from humans, that unless we create laws and policies to protect it, humans will destroy it. At the same time, in order to establish these parks and protected areas, the movement actually displaced Indigenous peoples who had been living on what later became the parklands. And sometimes they were allowed to stay, but they had to act out these very performative, like examples of Native American culture for tourists and essentially put their culture on display, which was very problematic. So through these courses I was taking, I started to understand these tensions between social justice and Indigenous movements and nature conservation movements. And I thought about how the land was steeped in culture through and through, and that this culture dynamic was really not included in a lot of the conservation conversations. So the term, which actually lended its name to the title of this webinar, land as a cultural phenomenon, was something that was used by one of my professors at university. And it really stuck with me because it's this idea of land and culture co-creating one another and affecting how each other looks and becomes. So another term that I learned at the same time was the idea of a pristine myth. So this term, the pristine myth, was coined by someone called William Denevan in 1992, and he wrote a paper on it. And it's essentially exactly what was happening with the national parks movement. It's a word used to define the view of the American continent as this wild, raw, untamed nature. And it actually completely eclipses the thousands of years of culture and history that came before colonization. And even more than that, the extent to which the landscape during pre-colonial times was very strongly shaped by human activity. So I think that the pristine myth was a product of colonists not being able to perceive how the land had been co-created with humans because it didn't conform to their view of cultivated land or changed land. But it was also a product of them being dismissive of land management practices that they did see taking place because they feared them or they didn't understand them. So the pristine myth really didn't account for things like Indigenous landscape management, which included controlled fires, which was this knowledge passed down through family lineages known as fire keepers. We know that controlled burns are a great way to decrease the risk of big and catastrophic forest fires and also add nutrients to soils. And but back then the colonists didn't understand that. So the Indigenous techniques were outlawed, and they also declined when land stewards were forced off of their traditional territories once the colonists came. So now, of course, these days, we see these huge forest fires happening all over the place. And governments have begun to work once again with Indigenous communities to bring back these practices. But of course, you can't really undo all of this damage that's been done to traditional knowledge. Another thing that colonists who arrived after the initial wave couldn't see or appreciate was the extensive landscape management in the form of pruning, seeding, cultivating, swidden agriculture, which is also called slash and burn agriculture, or different building technologies, including the floating gardens or chinampas, like the ones used in Tenochtitlan, which again is the image you see on the top left-hand corner. So these gardens used the lake water, which was full of decomposing organic material, to fertilize the gardens that were built on artificial islands. And Tenochtitlan had a population of 400,000 people before colonization, and before it was destroyed by early Spanish colonists in 1521. So it was a metropolis with roads, with all this development. It profoundly affected the landscape. But once this cultural phenomenon was destroyed, it's easy to forget about it if we don't actively return to it and learn about it. The truth is that the ancestors of Indigenous peoples came to the Americas 12,000 years ago, it's estimated, and the land is a cultural phenomenon that cannot be separated from Indigenous people themselves, even though this was what the colonizing process tried to do. The ways that Indigenous peoples interacted with landscapes informed culture, histories, trading practices, travel routes, mapping activities, and in turn, Indigenous cultures had a profound effect on what the landscape looked like, including what species were growing where, how far along the process of natural succession on a patch of land was, and of course, their built environment interacted with the landscape as well. And the other image you see there is just a representation of a traditional burn of the landscape. And I believe that comes from Oregon. So I'm just going to give an example right now from, again, my personal experience, how the perception of a landscape can depend on how much background information you have. So the top left photo was taken by myself when my husband, Victor, who is of Guatemalan origin, and myself were trekking in the Petén region of Guatemala. We trekked for 2 days through the jungle to reach this semi-excavated Mayan pyramid called La Danta. On the way, we saw countless small hills that we would have easily overlooked if our guide, Juan, had not pointed out that they were actually temples, dwellings, and other structures that were built by Mayan civilizations, and that had since been overgrown by the regenerating rainforest. We stopped at different viewpoints where we could see these little hills dotting the landscape. And we also learned that we were walking along a route that had once been a paved highway connecting various metropolises to one another. And so this experience really gave me a chance to experience for myself how easy it can be to overlook landscape histories when you don't know how to look, when you don't know how to read the land, and you don't do the work of educating yourself on what came before you, essentially. So I was thinking, as I was preparing this webinar, what are some different ways we can counteract this idea of a pristine myth of nature being separate from humans and not steeped in history and culture? And I discovered that one way to classify landscapes, which does take into account Indigenous histories, is called bioregionalism, where landscape regions are defined by landscape characteristics, but also by cultural similarities and resource use patterns. So according to Wikipedia, bioregions are defined by physical and environmental features, including watershed boundaries, soil and terrain characteristics. And bioregionalism stresses that the determination of a bioregion is also a cultural phenomenon, and it emphasizes local populations and their histories, knowledge, and solutions. So essentially, bioregions are defined through both time and space, and they comprise of land, people, and their shared history. So we're currently located in the Cascadia bioregion, which comprises most of BC, Washington, Oregon, and Idaho. And some of the characteristics of this bioregion are common cultural ties to the fishing of salmon, which includes sustenance, cultural, and spiritual practices around salmon by the Indigenous and First Nations communities. There's a history of extensive trading with the plateau people further inland, and the use of rivers and waterways as trading networks. And I found this great quote on this blog called Indigenize, and it said that bioregionalism is a call to become knowledgeable residents and guardians of the places where we live. Although we are seldom aware of it, we live in a naturally unique physical, ecological, historical, and cultural area whose boundaries are more often ridge tops than county lines and state borders. And I wanted to let you know that there's actually a fun bioregionalism quiz that you can take at regenerativedesign.org. It's linked at the end of my slides. And I think it can be a good activity to complete this test and kind of test your knowledge of your bioregion, and also like it prompts you to learn more about the region where you live, both landscape-wise and culture-wise. So next, I wanted to switch gears a little bit and offer you a case study from, again, my own experiences of some of the ways that cultures and their changing identities through time can be tied to the landscape, and in this case, to a particular plant. So in my undergrad, I had to do a project which is called a commodity chain, where I traced a key ingredient in a food item that can be bought in stores right here in my hometown. And I had to trace the path of this ingredient all the way from where it was first grown to the store shelf. And I chose the Maya Gold chocolate bar, which is produced by a company called Green and Blacks, which is now owned by Cadbury. And you can see the packaging, that was the original packaging that you see on the slides. It's quite different now. And when I was researching this, I honestly thought I would find a happy story, because this chocolate bar was organic, fair trade, committed to fair economic practices, pretty much like as sustainable of a purchase of chocolate as you can get. But I was kind of surprised, to be honest. So I learned that cacao used in these specific bars was grown in part by the Mopan Maya farmers in southern Belize, and also the Kekji Maya. It came from Belize. And traditionally, it focused on the Mopa Maya spiritual association. Sorry, I focused on the Mopan Maya's spiritual association with the cacao plant. And my research led me to understand that cacao had served the purpose of working as a currency, and then it slowly became more associated with spiritual and cultural ceremonies, where it was prepared as a spicy ceremonial and celebratory drink. And then in the 1970s, among these communities, cacao started to change its significance from a ceremonial back to a cash crop. And the researchers whose paper informed a lot of my projects stated that many of the cacao farmers with whom they spoke could no longer recall the stories and the legends associated with the cacao plant, only stating that it was something that had always been. And so there was this huge shift from the ceremonial value of a plant, and when it became used as something that was exported, something that had an economic value, the culture around it started to change and started to be lost. So the researchers whose paper I was looking at concluded that the change from the ceremonial to a cash crop over years had caused the loss of cultural richness around the cacao plant, and that whether it was fair trade or not, commercialization changed the relationship between the people and the land. Because they were under pressure to modernize, and given the required scale of commercial cacao production, many farmers started to abandon traditional common pool agricultural methods. They used to use a swidden method, which again is sometimes called slash and burn. I don't like using that term because it sounds very like violent, which is not what it was. It's actually a rotating farming system that uses cycles of fire, cultivation, and fallow periods to maintain fertility, and it also allows communal access to land. So This increased commercialization of the land reinforced a more class-based structure within some of the Mopan Maya communities, and it kind of led to the loss of this common pool access to land where traditional plants were grown. Ironically, at the same time, these communities were slowly at the same time as these communities were slowly losing their cultural ties to a sacred plant, Green and Blacks was actually using Mayan indigenous art to sell their chocolate bar. So I wanted to share this very specific case study with you to demonstrate some of the ways that plants, landscapes, and people are intimately tied to one another, and how easily these relationships can get affected, sometimes in unexpected ways. At the same time, it's interesting to note how we as consumers in the global north or the wealthier countries, we're actually tied to faraway landscapes through the products that we consume. And I think it's important to think about those relationships too. Like even in the most urban environments, what we pick up at the grocery store comes from a culture, comes from a place, comes from the land. And thinking about what responsibilities do we have to those faraway places and to the people that inhabit them. So I always urge people to kind of dig deeper than the label of conscious consumption or ethical consumption, and try and learn a little bit about the stories behind the products, as they can be quite surprising. Just to add, when I was doing this project, I traced the physical path of the cacao too. And for it to get from Belize to Vancouver, it actually went first to, I believe, the Dominican Republic, and then it got taken to Poland and the UK for different stages of cacao production. Then it got taken across the ocean to Toronto and then driven in a truck to Vancouver. So again, I was kind of reevaluating what sustainable consumption was, that this product, even though it came from the Americas, it actually did this crazy zigzag journey just so that I could have it. And what are all of the miles and energy associated with that? That was an interesting piece that I thought about too. Okay, so switching gears again, I would like to present a second case study, which is the story of a nomadic people that are known as the Van Gujars of India. And I learned about them during my master's program, as one of my professors had spent over 25 years or so getting to know the Van Gujars and studying the ways that their culture and lifestyle is tied to the landscape and to the lives of their cattle. So the Van Gujars are a group of nomadic indigenous people of the Muslim faith who have been marginalized for a very long time due to specifically their nomadic way of life. Every year they travel between spring pastures and overwintering grounds in order for their buffaloes, which is their main form of sustenance, to be fed and to stay healthy. Their yearly trips with their buffaloes, also known as transhumance, which is a kind of interesting phrase, transhumance, they take them across different mountains and forests. So it happened that they were excluded from their traditional migratory routes due to something called the Wildlife Protection Act of 1972, which created these protected, quote unquote, protected forest zones, something akin to the national parks movement in the US. And it turned out that this was actually a loss both for the Van Gujars and for the forest, because the forest, as a result of this act, became patchier and in worse conditions without the presence of the Van Gujars and their buffalo, because the buffalo had essentially formed this symbiotic relationship where they were fertilizing the soils of the forests. And later, they were allowed monitored access to these lands once again, but their routes were shortened and restricted, which gave the forest less time to recover between migrations. And again, it showed like just how complex this human landscape relationship for the Van Gujars was, and like just how fine of a balance they were experiencing with the land that they traversed during their migrations. The main problem was that the Van Gogers were not seen as part of the land, which is how they saw themselves, but by other people, they weren't seen as a part of the land. They were seen as lazy because of the slow pace of life that they led, and they were also seen as lawless because they did not belong to a sedentary community. So there was also an NGO that was set up at a certain time that was meant to represent them, but it ended up being more focused on its own image and funding than on the actual needs and wishes of the Van Gogers. And in general, it was hard for the NGO to see eye to eye with them because it required for someone to actually travel alongside of these people to understand how they saw the world. These were stories that were captured by my professor, who spent weeks and months at a time living alongside them. Her name is Pernilla, and she always said that their lifestyle moves at the rhythm of the buffalo. She described being transported to a completely different world over the series of a few weeks, and she explained in class how they would mourn the loss of a buffalo in the same way they would mourn the loss of a family member, and how the world seems to slow down and just acquire a specific rhythm. Pernilla also said that the Van Gogers and their buffalo are co-creators of the landscape. And at the same time, they are defined by the landscape, which gives them a sense of place, a sense of themselves, even though they don't identify as belonging to a given physical sedentary community. Their family and their cultural roles all depend on the roots and on the buffaloes that they tend. So the Forest Rights Act in recent years is showing some promise and some forward thinking in allowing the traditional roots to be restored, which is good news. I was reading about the other day. And yeah, so just to sum up, this was another case story to help you think about how traditional peoples in the modern context and how their identity is tied and helps to co-create the landscapes. So I did a brainstorm on the Permaculture Women's Guild Facebook group a couple of months ago, and I wanted to ask, what are some of the ways that people who do or engage with ecological design or permaculture could employ to engage respectfully with the landscapes surrounding them? One of the answers that came up pretty often was quite simple. It was just to research local peoples and their cultures. And to me, this is really a part of the sort of observe and interact stage of any ecological or permaculture design. Observe and interact is one of the permaculture principles, actually, and it's the idea of always taking the time to situate yourself in a landscape and understand the landscape before you begin changing it. I remember that when I was young, the Indigenous histories taught to us in school tended to be very sterile. I think that's changed now since I've been in school, but this was how I grew up. And I remember that it just was not it was not taught in a very engaging or empathic way. And I think that it's our responsibility to take a deeper interest, to learn about the stories of the places where we settle as much as we can. So during my studies in conservation, I learned about the Northwest Coast First Peoples. And one of the practices that I always will remember learning about was the potlatch system. And so the image on this slide depicts a Kwakwaka'wakw potlatch. So the Kwakwaka'wakw are the traditional peoples of the coastal areas of northeastern Vancouver Island and some parts of mainland British Columbia. And evidence shows that they had settled there for over 8,000 years. And so the potlatch was a feast where wealth was exchanged, where social kinship relationships were solidified, where hunting and fishing rights were defined, and people who held title or the right to be on a certain parcel of land were required to hold these feasts upon receiving their title, and their proprietorship of this land depended on them being able and willing to distribute their land's wealth to others, and then to also recount the oral history of the land at these potlatch events. So essentially, potlatches guarded against hoarding, and they diversified the wealth that was gained from the land. The potlatch was a space where reciprocity was practiced. So reciprocity is this idea of mutual giving and mutual interdependence. In essence, it's responding to a positive action with another positive action. And it's a very important process for solidifying societies and social relationships. We also learned in class that as part of a policy of assimilation, the federal government of Canada actually banned the potlatch from 1884 to 1951. So that means over 2 generations of First Nations peoples were not allowed to practice this cultural event rooted in the land. And during this time, the government saw the ceremony as anti-Christian, as reckless, as wasteful, etc. After I left university, I noticed that the idea of reciprocity is really the basis for a lot of alternative social and economic projects that people involved in permaculture and other sustainability-focused movements employ. So this includes things like time banks, seed and clothing swaps, the barter economy, potlucks, and community currencies. And I know that there are many other traditional cultures around the world which also practiced and still practice different forms of reciprocity. I've definitely seen this in some Eastern European cultures, which is my background, in Italy and others. But in general, I think it's beautiful and important to try our best to understand how many of the things we're trying to instill in our communities today were actually already there thousands of years ago, especially when they were already present on or in communities living exactly where we are currently living. So next, I want to segue to talk about a trend that I've noticed in permaculture or in regenerative design, which is actually pretty troubling. There seems to be this tendency to label things as permaculture techniques or regenerative agriculture techniques. And I think this is problematic when the traditional or indigenous origins of a particular practice, like for example, food forestry, are not highlighted and the practice is rebranded as belonging to this new movement of land stewardship that is often tied to more white middle class people. Especially, I think as permaculture has gained more traction and more notoriety in recent decades, many people have become introduced to it through the techniques that permaculture designers employ. And I think this leads to the misleading notion that there is such a thing, for example, as a permaculture technique, when for my personal opinion, that's not really a thing. I think it's important to remember that permaculture is the approach to design and the process that we follow as designers, not the specific techniques that we use. So food forestry, for example, was a common practice of hunter-gatherer societies in Southeast Asia, different parts of Africa, Japan, the Americas. And another common technique often associated with permaculture is the swale, which is a shallow ditch dug on the contour of the land that allows the water to percolate rather than run down a hillside. And the truth is that many traditional societies modified their landscape through building ditches to guide water across the landscape and to mitigate the effects of flooding and different rainfall events. Another technique that's gained a lot of notoriety in recent years is the use of biochar. And again, this is often talked about as something novel, or sometimes it's given credit as an ancient technique, and then not really much more detail is given beyond that, when really there's evidence of use of this technique by indigenous peoples of the Amazon and other areas. And the other picture there is what's known as an oya, which is a watering technique where you submerge unfired clay vessels in the soil and you fill that with water and it slowly percolates out to the land. And this was also used in various parts of the world in Asia and the Middle East. So I just think it's important to give credit when we don't know, and just to take the time as much as we can to research where things came from. And I think this leads me to talk a little bit about decolonization and decolonizing our relationship to land. And I think that decolonization is a really important part of creating healthy relationships with land, whether we live on Indigenous territories or not. I do think this can be an overwhelming process to think about. Most people might not know where to start or even what decolonization really means, even though they might have heard the word many times. So just a disclaimer, again, I'm not an expert by any means on decolonization, and I won't go into all of the details, as there are many amazing resources out there that you can find prepared by people much more qualified than me to teach on this. But what I understand decolonization to be is a process of identifying, taking apart and replacing behaviors, attitudes, beliefs, practices, and policies that are rooted in colonialism. So colonization is intimately linked also to the rise of capitalism, or as some people refer to it these days, neoliberalism, which is essentially the main form of doing things on the earth, or you could call it business as usual. And this refers to the growth of industry, trade, global markets, the idea of economic growth being the only dominant marker for human success, and the negative impacts that these huge forces have on communities and ecosystems in general. So there are practical ways that I think we can begin to decolonize, like changing racist laws, uplifting the voices of Indigenous, BIPOC, and other marginalized folks. But what I wanted to place a special focus on for this presentation was the inward process of decolonization. As again, I think it's one of those things that's not talked about quite as much as I think it should be, and I think it has the potential to inform our relationships to the land. So I actually attended a webinar myself recently, which was called Listening to the Land Together, and it was hosted by the Ecosystem Restoration Camps and Indigenous Wisdom Keepers. And one of the presenters, Dr. Kucha Risling-Baldi, touched on the inward process of decolonization and how it really begins within yourself. And excuse me, this reminded me of a course that I took back in 2017, which was called the Decolonize Yourself Creative Immersion, which was hosted by Heather Jo Flores. And actually, the same conversation about inward decolonization came up at a community farm research group meeting that I attended earlier this month. And so I can tell you that this topic of inward decolonization is definitely gaining traction and is starting to become on the forefront of people's minds. And so in these meetings, it was discussed how specifically settlers can often feel overwhelmed at the thought of decolonization because they don't realize that it's as much of an inward as it is an outward process. And the point that was made each time was that the inward process is what helps decolonization be authentic and not performative or only surface level. So relationships with landscapes are ongoing and ever evolving. And in order for us to build relationships of respect with the landscape around us, I personally think that decolonization is about questioning the ways that we internalize harmful practices and attitudes, and then thinking about ways that we can unlearn or counteract them. So some ways that I can think of that have been relevant in my own life are researching collaborative and cooperative and non-utilitarian ways to have relationships with landscapes and people, finding ways to meet my own needs through strong social relationships, not just money or stuff, and just consuming less in general. Also reflecting on judgments that I make about people based on internalized biases, even though sometimes I don't want to admit that I have them. Taking time for reflection and checking in rather than needing to always fill my time with being busy. And also over the past few years, through my work with nonprofits, I've been learning more and more about Indigenous processes with regards to holding space, organizing meetings, and building relationships. And I'm still very new to understanding these processes, but it's been very interesting for me to observe the importance of taking time to settle into an idea and weaving in stories and histories at the same time. I can say that I remember how when I was working on a project around homelessness in Kelowna last year, I had the chance to work with two Indigenous elders to plan a volunteer training event. And at first, when I engaged with them, I can admit that I felt some frustration sometimes at our meetings because I was coming from this mind frame of like, um, go, 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 like, let's just organize this, let's plan it, let's do it. But then I realized my mental state was completely rooted in a very colonial way of organizing, and I needed to shift my perspective and realize that other things were important, like just holding space for one another, like sharing stories and taking the time to really settle into topics. And I think that's something that I'm continuing to learn about. So just boiled all of that down into 3 points. I think that in order to decolonize ourselves or to begin or continue that process, we can recognize how we internalize colonial ways of thinking. We can research collaborative, cooperative, and non-utilitarian relationships with landscapes, and we can do our best to decolonize our daily practices. So as I said in my previous slide, I wanted to talk about ways of connecting with land that are not utilitarian. So there are many different ways to do this, of course, but I just wanted to highlight a few. The image above, or the slide, shows some examples of images of what is known as land art or ephemeral art. And you may have seen some photos similar to these on the internet before. And I actually learned about land art through the Decolonize Yourself Creative Immersion course that I took with Heather. And it really captured my imagination because it's a completely ephemeral or temporary kind of art. And this means it will get destroyed at some point. And also that what happens to it once it's installed is really beyond the control of the artist, so to say. And I've engaged in a few instances of ephemeral art, and I really enjoyed the process. I suggest if you're ever interested in doing it in a way where you don't plan the final outcome and you re-engage in a state of play with the resources at hand. So in these photos, we see just some stones that have been organized in a really beautiful way. One of the artists created this really interesting thing that looks like a crazy monster with teeth just in a crack of some rocks by arranging sticks of different lengths. Or this beautiful image of somebody who created a pattern in the sand just through walking on it. So here are some photos of land art that was made for the Kelowna Community Permaculture Design Certificate course that the RESES team co-taught in 2019. We weren't RESES then yet, but it was the same people. So I asked the students to create some land art on the first day of class because I wanted them to feel connected through their 5 senses to the space where the majority of the course was going to take place. And this was the Eco Center in Mission Creek Park in Kelowna. I also wanted them to connect in with their intuition, as I think sometimes with landscape design, even ecological landscape design or permaculture, we can still be very technical, scientific, and it can be this overly empirical process that I think sometimes can lose the element of true connection, which I actually think is essential to a good permaculture design. So for me, a big part of my own decolonization journey has been experiencing the landscapes with all of my senses. And not only experiencing them, but also placing value on and paying attention to the emotions, memories, and images that these experiences produce. Because I think that they send us messages about how we're doing, where we're going in life, and how we feel about it. I know that this might sound a bit wishy-washy, but that's probably because our minds are very colonized. I strongly believe that engaging participants in mindful activities that connect them to land, it really helped our permaculture course become a space where people were not only designing a landscape project, but they were also designing a bit of their life path. And I remember when we were teaching the course, there were certain days where we would sit down to lunch together and like people would just share very personal struggles that they were going through and how this permaculture design um, was a part of that and was helping them to navigate that. And I think that creating space for that is so valuable. And realizing that our lives are braided together with the landscape is, I think, really what permaculture or ecological design is about, and is a journey that I'm personally on, I think, for the rest of my life. So if any of you are interested in any further reading on this or similar topics, there was a book that I was gifted by my husband that I strongly recommend. It's called Landmarks, and it's by an author called Robert Macfarlane, who's a British writer and scholar. And he really, in his book, brings home the point about how cultures and the experiences of the human body is strongly intertwined with the land. So first of all, he talks about how cultural elements, specifically language and words, are connected to how we treat and how we see the land. And he highlights lists of words from the many different traditional languages present in the British Isles, some of whom have or are being lost, and how they were specific to particular phenomena in nature. I was just flipping through the pages and I found a couple of interesting ones. From Exmoor, there is a word called, and I might not be pronouncing it correctly, but it was amel, and it referred to leaves, grasses, blades, and sprigs lit up by the sunshine streaming through mist. Specifically, that word meant specifically that phenomenon. And then there was another word from North England, which was ing, which described a wet meadow specifically by the side of a river. So I was just really interested to read all of these words that defined a thing that I would never have even thought of as a phenomenon in and of itself. And so Robert Macfarlane stresses that when old languages and words are lost, we lose the ability to even see certain phenomena of nature, which again made me think back to that idea of the pristine myth and not being able to see certain things because we don't have a context for them. And he said that when we lose these words, these phenomena, they just blend into the overall scene. And this can cause a loss of appreciation, of caring for the land, and of course, a loss of land-based knowledge. And so if we transpose that to a North American context, we of course can talk about how many Indigenous communities are today fighting really hard against the loss of their traditional languages, and how the loss of these languages is not just about the language itself, but also about the land-based knowledge that is interwoven into it, and that if certain words are gone, then certain concepts might also be lost too. And Macfarlane also highlights a few British authors who wrote these incredible literary pieces based on their experiences understanding nature through their senses. So the lady pictured in the bottom right-hand corner is called Nan Shepherd. She wrote a book called The Living Mountain, which is completely based on her walks, like her daily walks in the they're called the Cairngorm Mountains of Scotland. And her whole life was defined by her experiences in these mountains. And she writes the most, I think her book is only 100 pages, but it's like beautiful prose, completely mesmerizing. And I would say spiritual. And it was just based on her everyday walks in the mountains. And she got to know these mountains like in every time of year, every time of day. She knew all the plants. She knew all these different pathways. And it really, like, her life was very much defined by these mountains and who she was. And he also talks about another author called Roger Deacon, who was on a mission to learn about his country, about the UK, by swimming in most of the major bodies of water located in it. And so the book he refers to is called Waterlog. And there's a beautiful quote that I found from the book that I'm actually going to finish off my presentation with. So he wrote, "I grew convinced that following water, flowing with it, would be a way of getting under the skin of things, of learning something new. I might learn about myself too." And I think I felt drawn to this book and journey because, well, my dad has practiced cold water ocean swimming for probably like 2 decades now. And I can definitely see the difference in his demeanor before and after he goes swimming. And I always reflect on, like, for myself too, when I go and take an immersive walk in nature, I feel like it feels like a return to myself. And if we don't take like the active steps to do that kind of thing, to be really mindful and to just kind of like be in nature without expecting it to return something to us, then I think we're really losing out on knowing the landscape and on knowing ourselves. So anyway, I just crossed the hour mark, I think. So I guess to summarize what I wanted to accomplish with this presentation is just to ruminate really about how people and nature are interconnected in ways that can be cruel, harmful, but also beautiful and mindful, and how we co-create natural spaces in collaboration with plants, animals, and physical landscape elements. So with that said, I think I'm going to close out my portion of the presentation, and I'm actually going to introduce my sister Alice, who's going to be talking about her master's project in architecture, which brings in some of these themes in, I think, a really interesting way. And we were having some technical difficulties with her sharing her screen, so I actually incorporated her slides into my slides. So Alice, are you there?
Yep.
Okay. Take it away.
Okay. Hi, everyone. So thanks, Lucy, for the wonderful presentation. And it's a really great jumping off point with you, especially talking about rivers and water and the comparison of like healthy and unhealthy relationships to nature, because it's a part of it's a theme in my current thesis project. So I've been developing this for 2 semesters, and I'm just going to be showing you a little snippet. It's based on research that I was, independent research I was allowed to do through my university, which is Dalhousie University, to go do in Chile. So maybe you can switch to the next slide.
Yeah. And can you tell everyone how long you were there?
I was there for 3 weeks. So I spent 2 weeks going down, or driving down, 1 week driving down a river, the Baker River in the Patagonian region of Aysén, and then 1 week up in Santiago, the capital, kind of focusing on the river that runs through the center of the city called the Mapocho River.
Okay, cool.
Okay. So just very vaguely, the project is about cultural narratives coming from Chile's mountains and rivers. And then maybe we can go to the next slide. Yeah, so my research was inspired by the Patagonia Sin Represas movement, which took place between 2011 and 2014, during which time protesting happened, which was against the building of 2 hydroelectric dams along Patagonia's Baker River. And so this protesting eventually spread and notably started to happen along the national capital in Santiago, along their own river's banks, the Mapocho River. And ultimately, just the sheer numbers of people that were involved in the movement led to the revoking of the permit to build of the company that was interested in doing that, the project was called Hidrosen and the company was called Endesa. So this snapshot in history brought together seemingly binary cultural relationships to Chile's watershed, as the Mapocho River is notoriously polluted. So I think you saw a picture of it up in the, maybe that showed that more in the slide in the photographic section that was kind of very dark brown, and you see this graffiti and like these power lines. So it's heavily polluted. Thank you, Lucy. And then,
Can you talk a bit about you were talking about the diversity of the movement against the hydroelectric projects?
Yeah, I'll get to that point, sorry. So yeah, it was a binary relationship towards the attitudes of rivers in Chile. So the one being intensely polluted and a contested public space currently, and then the other, the Baker River, being ecologically much healthier. Yet I was convinced or was looking for kind of an underlying spatial and cultural connectivity or a set of principles of how people related to the watersheds in the country that maybe had to do something with national identity or cultural identity. Okay, so the movement was described as rhizomatic, meaning coming from, or the coming together of multiple perspectives. In the case of the Patagonia Sin Represas movement, these perspectives included an orientation towards work, art, indigenous issues, conservation, and religion. Okay, so maybe you can go to the next slide. So here you can see this is just a vague description of the connection between landscape, but also settlement patterns. So the image to the left is sections taken through the landscape showing the overarching similarity. I think mom's making fun of you. But anyway, the overarching similarity of the landscape, mountains and rivers throughout the country, but minor differences in the morphology of some of these. And then on the right, you can see again that there's a repetition in the rivers, the watersheds as emptying from the Andes down to the Pacific, and then how the roads, the way that people have inscribed culture upon the landscape or developed, are also following the patterns of the rivers, but also expanding southward. So you could say that the pattern of settlement in Chile, and even if you look back in time, is as supporting expansion from north to south and trade from east to west, and then settlement as kind of radially from the rivers. Okay, if you can go to the next slide. Thank you. Okay, so this is a comparison, a little bit more zoomed out, but and a little more maybe in depth of the differences between the Mapocho River, which is at the center of Santiago, the nation's capital, and the Baker River, which is further south in Patagonia, roughly 1,500 kilometers away, and the different types of cultural settlement. So you can see the pink parts are urban settlement. They're very small dots because the towns are very small in this region along the Baker. The gray is farming. So there was a lot of agricultural development along the Mapocho. It was a very fertile place and was the reason, this is why it became the place where the Spanish settled coming down from Peru. And then there's also smaller scale gaucho farming along the Baker River. And then the huge green spots around the Baker River are also national parks and conservation areas. So one of them is the Conservación Patagónica, which was oriented towards restoring the biodiversity, whereas the others are more about preserving the natural beauty or biodiversity. But that had been formerly gaucho farming land that became unviable, and then people took the action to help try to restore it. So you can compare the rivers or the culture along the rivers, one being kind of more erased or palimpsest. So with urban or processes such as agriculture, tunneling, infrastructure, and canalization and mining on the Mapocho, and then kind of restoration or more sustainable agricultural or cultural connections to the river in Patagonia. So then my research became focused on understanding the paths of the artist, the worker, the indigenous person, the religious practitioner, and conservationist, and how their paths would take them, or how their paths would build their relationship to the landscape on the Baker watershed and on the Mapocho River. So my method is to try to understand how their visual perception of the landscape was both altered by their path and how they used this to orient themselves in their daily tasks. So maybe if you can go to the next slide. This is just an example of one case study. This was looking back at colonial times, how the Mapocho River changed. So you can see that the canal was built And there was park happening around, or that was built also there. But you can also see that the architecture, this is just a representation, but not particularly, this doesn't really exist anymore in such uniformity. So what I learned from looking at the architecture through time and the paths through time along the Mapocha River is that it was kind of like archetypal. So what that means is that it came from a top-down perspective relating to the idea of expression of ideology and resulting in various types of erasures and illegibility and non-connections to the landscape or acknowledgements of the landscape. Maybe you can go to the next one, Lucy. So these are representations of the architecture along a town in the Baker River, actually at the mouth of the river into the ocean, or kind of a fjord. It's called Tortel. So in looking at this architecture in other towns along the Baker River, the architecture was intensely different in that it kind of came to represent what I would call typologies. So it was created in a bottom-up kind of approach, and it had to do with an economy of means. And the way that the architecture changed through time was through transition, and was more in respect of the natural environment, because the people here depended much more heavily on the landscape. And so even once, they transitioned from the water threshold being about, fishermen and their access to subsistence, and now with more tourism coming in and the fisheries no longer, or the fishing industry there no longer being used as much, the public spaces kind of came to still reflect that similar connection and respect to the landscape. Although it's still imperfect, as it's still a polluted place. Yeah, so these are just some general ideas or things that I learned in looking at how different people and their different goals in settlement relate to the natural environment. And so my mission now and how I'm developing my thesis is to abstract the perception of these paths and architecturally represent them along the main protest routes in Santiago as a connection to both the former movement, but also the abstract connections, a comment on the underlying kind of pan-Chilean connectivity to rivers and mountains. The hope is that these abstractions would incite empathetic connections and help prevent future threats to the Chilean watershed. So the abstractions from Santiago are kind of like the worst case situation or connection to the water, whereas those from Patagonia are more like the best case, or what could be lost if there are further threats to this watershed or others throughout Chile. Yeah, so that's just like a little snippet of my thesis presentation, and thank you for letting me share that with you guys. That's kind of all I have to say.
And so Alice, you were telling me yesterday too that the buildings that you're designing, that you will be designing as part of your project, are going to be memorializing the social movements that took place along these rivers, and you're going to be weaving in the perspectives that the different participants in the social movements had of the landscapes into how the buildings are designed, right?
Yeah, so it's not really about the social movements, but just about the cultural everyday connection to the water. So what kind of might have inspired people to protest? So them saying, hey, this will be lost if we dam this river. Yeah, and then what I would call what the program of the buildings that I'm going to develop, or pavilions that I'm going to develop, are living monuments. So living monuments acknowledge a complex and layered history, and also the potential for these issues to continue to be relevant into the future in a currently undefined way. So allowing for both of those elements to be incorporated into the design.
Cool. Okay, thank you. Okay, so hello again, everybody. So Alice and I have a very similar voice. So now it's Lucie talking. This is just a list of resources that I drew upon for the creation of my presentation today. And so these will be available in the recording if you guys, well, I'll be sending it out to all of the participants who signed up to support the workshop. I know there were a few people who signed up but couldn't actually make it. So I want to make these resources available to everyone. And then I just wanted to say a huge thank you to everybody who came out to support our first event. Thank you to Alice, thank you to Megan, thank you to everybody who's on the call today and everybody who donated to RESES. We're still at the early stages of developing as an organization, so all of this support really means a lot. If you want to learn more about us, you can check out RESES, RESES.org, or you can email us at rhizomeecosocial@gmail.com. And I'm going to, okay, I think I'm not sharing my, am I still? No, stop sharing. There we go. Hi. So yeah, if anybody has any questions or would like to make any comments, I'm happy to stay on for as long as people would like to talk. And I know that we have some people joining us here from different areas. So we've got some local folks here in the Okanagan, but we also have people in different communities in the United States and also in Europe. So if anybody wanted to share anything from their personal journey of creating a relationship with landscape or decolonizing, I would really love to hear. And I don't know, Megan, if like how we would want to moderate that, if people should write it in the chat or just put their hands up.
I think they could just put their hands up or unmic themselves. We're a pretty good group here. I did have a question in the chat from Liz, and it was just kind of during the presentation of Liz wants to talk to it on her own, but she was just asking, she has a lot of frustrations and just, you know, what can you do to basically build yourself towards the decolonization? I know you talked about it in your slide. You did a great job. If you wanted to elaborate a little bit.
Yeah, I'm just looking for her message here.
Sorry, yeah, it's a little further up.
Sorry, I guess my thing is I'm just having a lot of issues around like, well, like privatization of land and like ownership in general, and like, I mean, I don't own any land, I don't have any land, but just like how, especially like I think because I work as a gardener too, like how to make things, I guess, equitable. Like how can, like, it's one thing for me to talk about things and do whatever, but like what are like some real action steps on actually making things equitable, I guess. I don't know. Maybe I'm not wording it right.
No, I totally know what you mean. And yeah, that's something I also have struggled with. But I think like for me, the process of like just researching and educating myself, I have found very empowering. So yeah, as I said, I'm not an expert on decolonization by any means, but just reading articles and attending webinars. I remember when I was on that webinar that was called Listening to the Land Together, the lady, Kutcha Riesling-Baldi, who's like a PhD doctor who teaches about these topics, she was saying a lot of especially settler folks struggle with the same thing. And they like, well, I guess in this case, she was talking specifically about landowners kind of coming up to her and saying, I don't know what to do, like how to reconcile land ownership on these territories. Like, do you just want my land? Do you want my house? And she's like, you know, if I had a dime for every time someone said that to me. But she said a lot of the times when Indigenous communities are talking about, you know, getting land back, they're quite often talking about like crown land and these big parcels of land that are their traditional territories, but are just being held by the government. So there's that whole discussion too. But I think just, you know, like education and like in ways that we know how to stand in solidarity and like not understanding that we don't always have the answer, but just being willing to learn, I think is a really big piece. I don't know if anybody else has maybe some other ideas that it could pop in.
Haruko would like to speak. Haruko has her hand up.
Hi. So, yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. That's both presentation was really insightful, Especially, I guess I have couple points, and one of them relate to what you just discussed, and especially the one internal, what's the word? Internal decolonization. That concept, it was in my head as a concept, but I didn't know exact word to describe. So when you try to understand or try to untangle this mess, sometimes having a word like that really helps to understand, okay, this is what I'm thinking about, and this is a word I can use to put in a Google to find more information about it. Instead of typing paragraph in the Google, doesn't really help me. So that was very helpful. And also duality in the culture, in the sense of the time, as well as not everything is good, but that's still the part of a culture. So in the current state, we have kind of polar culture. One is really live with nature, understand the nature type of culture, and then the other one is very driven to be maybe materialistic or economically driven, but they both exist, and we live in this such a huge duality. And my question is, culture is always dynamic, especially, I'm from different country. So what would define a culture? And more importantly, where are we going from here? What kind of culture we wanted to portray in the future, what's coming? And sometimes we focus, I think it is very important to learn what is culture behind us, but we also need to learn what we are right now and where are we going from here. And your presentation gave us some kind of insight to deeper into the subject, I think.
Yeah, that's a really great comment, Haruko. It kind of reminded me of something that I think it's like a concept that I've been like developing in my mind through my education in permaculture and ecological design, which is like the ability to define things at different scales. So like this concept of culture, I think is such a big concept. And I remember like spending so much time with like in class and just talking with people of like, what is culture? And even like the word ecosystem, what is an ecosystem? And I think it kind of reminds me that it's useful sometimes to like really zoom in on something on a small scale and talk about like, well, what is the culture I want to cultivate, like me by myself, with myself, or like with my family, with my friends, with my broader community, with my country, with the world, it's sometimes useful to know that like things that use the same term, like culture or ecosystem, can be defined at different scales, and it's at different points in time, it's useful to look at them through like a more zoomed in or a more zoomed out perspective. And sometimes like when we think about decolonization, we often have this zoomed out perspective of like, the world needs to decolonize and it needs to change. And like, how do we get to that decolonized world? And that's not really a scale at which most of us can act. So looking at what are the scales where we can take action and where we don't feel so overwhelmed, I think is like a really useful tool in our tool belt.
I think you had done like, to me, something that comes to mind when you were talking about your, like language has a lot to play with it, obviously, and just how, one word describes that phenomenon. I know for me personally, with biodynamic gardening, when I enter into a space, I'm always connecting to the land. I'm looking at that phenomena. So yeah, it can be really small scales, quite large. Great question, Haruko.
Yeah, thank you. I believe we have a few folks joining us from the UK today. And I don't know if they're in the chat right now. I just think I saw them sign up through the Eventbrite. So I would really love to have or we have Natalie from Sweden as well. I would love to have some folks to provide maybe a European perspective on this, because obviously I live in North America. Even though I was born in Europe, I come from a North American frame of reference, especially for this presentation in general. But if anybody would like to share an international perspective and how decolonization is talked about in those spaces, that would be really interesting also for me to hear. So I don't know if anybody would like to talk on that.
I'm not, is it okay to talk?
Yes.
I'm not a specialist of the issue. I've just started permaculture just a few years back. I'm actually French, so I'm living in Sweden now. But as a French person, and I never considered decolonization before, because I have no idea how long my family has been in France for, but it goes back a long time. We don't have this settlers and indigenous people relationship like you have. So until I started looking into permaculture and following the permaculture women gal discussions, I had absolutely no idea of this. So I find it really strange. But the inward one, because we've been formatted to this capitalism and so on, this is something I can work on. Of course, now I'm in Sweden, so I'm learning a whole new world.
Yes.
But yeah, that was just my take as a European, because we haven't moved so recently.
Mm-hmm. And actually, well, I did my master's degree in Sweden, and I was really interested to learn about the processes for organizing socially in Sweden and how they're different from North America. In Sweden, people seemed in general more knowledgeable about more kind of cooperative decision making and less hierarchical social structures. And I wonder if that way of organizing also affects relationships to land on a personal level. I don't know, Natalie, did you find any differences between the French way of organizing things and the Swedish way? And did that affect you in any way or change your perspective at all?
Well, the French way is very bureaucratic, so you just do as you're told. And the Swedish way is, we laugh because I'm in an international community. I'm actually working at the same institute you did your master's in Sweden, by coincidence. But also my husband works for an international research organization here, and we say, oh, a meeting with Swedes, nobody can make decisions. You'll have meeting after meeting, and one meeting to talk about the previous meeting, and it's a long process. It takes time, so we laugh about that. Mm-hmm. So, but regarding to land, I'm not so certain, so sure. I did a lot of permaculture course with people who are trying to regenerate, permaculturists, and trying to regenerate the land and the circular economy and so on, local economy. But I'm not so knowledgeable on this. Sorry.
That's okay. Thank you for sharing, Natalie.
I do have something to add. I've done, I've had the opportunity to sit with a lot of consensus-based models. So doing sociocracy, sort of egalitarian work. And I find the exact same thing. It's a lot of talking, a lot of meetings. When you have a decision maker, the hierarchy base, the decision just happens, whether you're consulted or not. It's made with a small group of people. But in a sociocracy, there's a heavy discussion, because we don't make any movement until we're all consensus-based and agreeing. So yeah, it can take a long process. But in the end, the product will be something we all agree upon. Whereas when you do the sort of top down, it's decided, and then maybe we amend because we see changes need to happen. So yeah, it's when I first shifted to that model for myself, coming from a different perspective, it was quite a challenge. And I saw like it challenged me a lot. So something different views for me.
Yeah, I can definitely say that, yeah, when you're transitioning to like a new way of doing something, there's always that process, especially at the beginning, where you're like, this is unfamiliar, this is taking too long, I don't like this. But I think maybe it just takes some time sometimes to like settle into that and recognize that there's other benefits that, you know, I really am noticing how conditioned my mind is to like fast, 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 need the results right now kind of thing, because there's so much to do in daily life and like you just want to get it done. So I've been finding like a lot of value even in feeling frustrated with these like slower and different methods of organizing. I think we have Lorna from the UK who would like to contribute. So Lorna, if you want to say anything, go for it.
Hiya, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Oh, hang on, you can't see me, sorry. Yeah, so you're kind of asking partly about kind of like the approach to decolonisation. So my experience is that I kind of first came across it maybe about 5 or so years ago when I'd started to get involved in a network of people in Birmingham, which is our second biggest city in England, who quite young, mostly under 30s, and a real mix of Black people, people of colour and white people, mostly quite creative. And they started, some people, mostly driven by Black people, so kind of second or third generation Afro-Caribbean, they started organising events around kind of decolonisation. So I was going to those. And then I'd say latterly, you know, I'm reading people like Layla Said's book, Me and White Supremacy, Ibram X. Kendi, How to Be an Anti-Racist. So I feel as though that if you're UK based, it's kind of like quite a white middle class thing to kind of be interested in this. The teachings are coming from mostly Black people, or that's where I'm looking to them from. And I was smiling when you were talking about the kind of fast, because the kind of the parallel journey I've been on as well is that I kind of started, came across just a book in a little book in a bookshop when I was on holiday a few years ago, called Destination Simple by someone called Brooke McAllery, who's based in Australia. And I kind of got pulled into this whole kind of slow living, simple living, kind of like set of people, you know, kind of involving decluttering and things like that in there, but kind of much more than that, going much wider than that. And it's really changed the way that I work. I do community work, and yeah, you know, just even the way that I convene now is just so very, very different because of the intentionality. But also I'm on the Permaculture Women's Guild permaculture course as well, so that's kind of only added and layered more. So yeah, that it's what I've struggled with the permaculture course is the questions about kind of looking at the land and the history of the land, because the peoples who were on the land that I live on, that I'm joining this call from, were of this land other than slaves they might have brought in, you know, whether they called them slaves or not. So it's kind of like really kind of, I was really struggling to figure it out, but your mention of Rob McFarlane's book and Nan Shepherd's has made me think, oh, maybe I need to look at what some of the words were from this part of England that relate to nature, and maybe that could take me on a little journey. So thank you for that.
Yeah, no problem. And I really think that like the term colonization can also encompass like the loss of regional cultures. Like I know I don't have a huge history on UK and like all the different languages and cultural groups that were there, but I know a little bit about like Italy and Spain and how there has been this like erasure of regional languages and cultures that were once like super diverse and with like since like the 1950s and like modernization, or even before then, a lot of those cultures and languages were suppressed, and now they're seeing like a revitalization. And I think you can also look at it from that perspective too. Like these old land-based traditions and cultures, like how did they relate to the land? And you know, like even if they are your ancestors, like how are their lives different? And how has colonization, or this like very capitalist society, changed that? And like maybe which parts of it might it be good to like think about again and like bring back and revitalize. I know in Spain, for example, which is something I can talk about a little bit because I spent quite a bit of time there. There's a region in the northeast called Galicia where they have their own language called Galician. And there was a period of time where I don't know if it was outlawed or it was just really looked down upon for parents to teach their kids Galician. And this was like a whole generation of kids who grew up not speaking the same language as their parents. And now there's this resurgence amongst the young people to bring back the language and also bring back some of the words that only exist in Galician. And I remember one of them that a friend of mine taught me, which is toxo. And it means like a plant that is prickly on the outside, but soft on the inside. And it's specifically used to refer to a person who's kind of like gruff and grumpy, but then like a good person on the inside. And I just thought it was kind of a cool connection of like this nature-based word that ties into what a person is like and only exists in this one language. And so just things like that, I think are really cool to think about.
Yeah, I think Liz had something interesting to say in the chat, and I kind of would mirror that, encourage her to share it. But yeah, I think exactly, you know, standardization of languages erases these regional dialects. And the importance, I know, just with my studies here in the West Coast First Nations and our local First people, is that that's exactly it. They developed the language when Turtle Island was created, when Mother Earth was created, and Sky Woman danced on her to create the land that we call Earth, into Turtle Island. And with that, you know, those first peoples, they developed their language based on what nature provided, because they learned from the plants and animals and creatures there, the plant, land, and water, and they use that language from nature. So it's kind of you know, with our evolution of colonization, industrialization, and our loss of first peoples to pass that language, it's a very powerful thing when you go back to learn it. Like, what a beautiful way. See that connection?
Yeah.
Like, what I also was thinking too when I said that, and I didn't really specify that either, was like even when I think about how like we learn languages in school, like when I did university, like German, and it's like, oh, they're teaching High German, and it's one dialect, and that's like pretty much the only dialect you're going to learn, like any sort of schooling for it, which erases like any sort of German dialect like outside of that, like in Germany or even like Switzerland. It's really like, and I think like French is sort of similar when they teach that in schools, because like, you know, the dialect they're teaching in schools is not like what they speak in Quebec at all. So like, I don't know, it's just weird.
That always seems to be a topic for me is academia, because I have no formal classic training. All of my background is through practical hands-on work, and I've dedicated my life always in the garden from day of birth until current, and that's where I worked my career. And yeah, and I think academia does that in our schools for our children, but also in the plant world and through permaculture and sort of discussions we're having today. But yeah, I think that's a very powerful tool, the way we use academia in our society and how we portray some people as being relevant with information, whereas maybe not others. And, you know, so we value that sort of, you know, where is that value?
Exactly.
Yeah. There's a nice comment here from Haruko who says that poems are also like ephemeral, I guess, art and a very strong tie to nature, like haikus, which is, yeah, that's a really good point, Haruko. Poetry can be super evocative of the landscape. Definitely. And I also wanted to layer on, like, just back to that discussion of language, which is so cool because, like, I studied languages in my undergrad, so it's really cool that we're talking about that now. But even just like, I think sometimes if enough of the culture around a language is lost, even if the word is preserved, the full meaning cannot be understood by like modern day people sometimes because it can only be understood in the context of a culture. So there's like this whole other layer of like the full meaning of a word and preserving that too, which I think is cool to think about.
Yeah, well put.
Okay. Do we have anybody else who'd like to share anything? Okay. Oh, Hillary would like to speak. I'll go for it, Hillary. I'm glad you made it into the webinar. I just saw your email a couple of minutes ago that you were having troubles, and I was like, oh no.
Yeah, I couldn't find the link in the email. I finally found it. It took me ages, but I'm here. I live on Lucie Island, which is in the middle of the Salish Sea, and I just wanted to share like an incident that's happened recently as another example of a way to sort of contribute to decolonization. Like I think the internal piece is really, really important. But I think the other thing that we can do as like privileged settlers is to sort of stand up for our First Nations friends. And which can be tricky because like there actually aren't any First Nations people here on my island. It's kind of an interesting example because it was sort of in the middle of everything, and there's a lot of really strong archaeological evidence that there were like large settlements here. But in the current like modern context, there's all these nations around Lucie that lay some claim to Lucie and would like to be able to, you know, harvest resources and stuff, but there's no tribe anymore that was based here because there was actually this myth that nobody was here, which was kind of bullshit. But because I think what my understanding is that like when disease came through before white settlers were even here, they basically wiped out and sort of dispersed to other places. So something that's happened recently is that the provincial government is trying to grant a First Nations woodlot license to the and it's really interesting because they're trying to provide them with some land and do this sort of reconciliation thing, but the way they're doing it is really a load of crap, and it's like part of this woodlot license that requires that they cut logs to meet an annual allowable cut, and the land that they're offering them on Lucie, like Lucie is really remote. We only have a passenger-only ferry. The access to this piece that they're offering them is really inaccessible. It's going to cost them a bunch of money to log it, and so in order to meet their annual allowable cut, they're going to have to like do a huge clear cut at one point, and you know, this whole sort of thing. And so there's a bunch of people on my island who have been writing letters and stuff saying like, we really want to support reconciliation, but this is a really shitty idea, and it's really kind of insulting to the Nations that you're doing it this way. So there's place for activism and like, you know, writing letters to the government that sort of say like, yes, I support reconciliation and I want to see, you know, public, like BC has a lot of public land, quote unquote crown land, right? And most of the reconciliation action that's going to happen, you're right, it's not going to be like taking over people's houses, right? It's going to be about private land. It's going to be about these huge tracts of public land. So I think there's a place for, you know, going through all the internal decolonization and sort of like figuring out what.
Sorry, Hillary, your audio's a little bit patchy there. Oh, I think she might have gotten cut off. If you want to post anything in the chat, Hillary, we can head over there to finish reading what you wanted to say. But it was very interesting. Oh, that was about it. Okay, yeah, really interesting how, yeah, like the process of reconciliation with land is so complex, and how, yeah, like I think it sounds like what you're saying is that the government is still taking a very like A to B kind of approach. Like, okay, you want this land, here's the patch, here's what you need to do. And it isn't really taking like a decolonized approach to the actual reconciliation process. So that's very interesting. Thank you for contributing.
And what a ridiculous place to log. Liskiti Island. Sorry, Hillary, you have to go through that. Yeah, I think that's interesting. I can't speak to maybe like the decolonization way, but I can speak as a woman. And I know when these sort of tactics are done in feminism, this can be quite discerning. You sort of like, sure, we'll support you, but you have to do this. So it's kind of, you know, to me, it's just more repressive, right? It's the action of, we'll create a food bank, but we actually don't feed people, right? So it looks like it's being done, but then the real action and the outcome is actually more disruptive and can be destructive. I think with permaculture, I see this a lot. People, we're going to go in and permaculture this space. Mm-hmm. So people just go in, they show up, they got the organic stuff, they're going to put seeds in, but no one ever thought to ask the stewards of the land there, or for permission, or about what the longevity of that's going to look like. So I think it's interesting. Thanks, Hillary, for sharing.
Yeah, I think this is one reason why I've struggled a lot with permaculture. Like there's been a lot of times in the last 10 years where I've thought of like just kind of distancing myself from the community because I've seen a lot of harmful practices come out of the community. But then at the same time, there's things like the Women's Guild, and there's like, there's specific spaces dedicated to BIPOC folks participating in permaculture. And there's like this whole queer permaculture movement coming out of Australia now too, and bringing in like these diverse voices, which is what has kept me engaged. And then this like really awesome process that you get taught like how to design something. But definitely like whenever I talk about permaculture or ecological design, I want to stress that it's like not the same thing to every person. And I think because it's become so broad and big now, different communities will interpret it in different ways. And for some people, permaculture is just like a cool way to garden, and that's it. And that's how it gets taught sometimes by some teachers. So yeah, I think like if you guys are talking to me, I'm going to share my perspective on what it is. But if you talk to someone else, they might share something completely different. So it can be kind of like a tricky world to navigate. Yeah. Oh, Haruko would like to share. Go for it, Haruko.
Thank you. Yeah, the nice segue for the permaculture too. So something I like to share is I found that technique is separated from what is actually drive to become the technique. And that's like the language lost, or like Lucie mentioned earlier, just knowing a word doesn't mean you understand the context of the word. And it feels like the technique is left, the origin of how that's derived, and especially permaculture give you the tool. The first rule is observe. Like Megan said, people forget the first rule of observe, and that includes talking to what the knowledge people, the people who are really knowledgeable in the area, and also the feedback loops. People often lost that. Even in the technique method, people just use it as a new cell phone. This is a new gadget, I can use it. But the permaculture always comes with a feed loop, and then assess, and then re-evaluate, and re-evolving. And that kind of the fundamental concept seems to be sometimes lost in this really go, go, go style thinking.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, I can attest to that. I remember, again, like reflecting on my own self, I remember I was part of a permaculture group for students when I was doing my master's, and we found this mentor in our community who was an older lady and knew a lot about permaculture, and we set it up so that we would go to her house once a week, and we would all have lunch together and talk about concepts, and then in the afternoon we would work, and we would help her build some projects on her land in exchange for her sharing her knowledge. And during those first couple of sessions, we were like, okay, we like came with our notebooks and we were like, teach us, ready to like write everything down and like, you know, get it down in writing, get it into our heads. We're going to know permaculture. And her approach was so different. She was like, calm down, guys. This is going to be a slow process. We're going to eat. We're going to talk. I'm going to tell you some stories. It's like, again, back to that conversation of needing to like recalibrate and understand the context. Like in that case, we had to understand the context of her property and her journey through permaculture. And she didn't want to share that in like a point form way. And so, yeah, I think that's really important. Liz was saying, Megan, I appreciate you saying the things in my brain that I can't seem to articulate. That's a great comment.
Yeah, no worries. I think, yeah, sorry, I lost my train of thought there. If anybody else would like to share. I think observation, from my perspective, I get asked a lot to consult and help with gardening in our local area, just because I've been trained in the art. And I would say it's much different, my gardening, from maybe others. And it's because I do observe and I do build that relationship with each plant. And I never approached it from the academia way. I just existed in that way with them. And that's how I've learned to garden. But I see permaculture so much wider than that. And of course, I've come under the permaculture blanket because I feel like biodynamic agriculture is not as known maybe, or permaculture just gives me that reference for people to understand. But of course, I see myself as someone who observes the landscape and uses the landscapes to predict my planting and my gardening and what I do at that time. So I watch the forsythia, and when it's blooming, then I put my bees in the ground. You know, it's understanding the plants in our local area and how they react. But like I think you were saying before, permaculture is so much more than gardening. I've had the opportunity to show people through gardening, and it's very easy to show. But people, yeah, it can also, as you said, it's our social structure. It's how we exist.
Mm-hmm. And I have to say, a lot of the projects, like the different permaculture-based projects that I've come across in the last decade, I've seen some that have been successful and others that haven't. And usually the ones that haven't, and by not being successful, I mean like the people participating stopped participating, or the project didn't reach whatever goal it had. It's usually because it was missing like a social component, like the people looking after the project weren't all on the same page, or they thought they were getting into one thing, but it was actually a different thing. So I think that like those social pieces, like in the Permaculture Women's Guild course, we call them invisible structures. I think they're so important to take into consideration.
And I think when I took my permaculture course, and really the only reason why I took the course, of course, I've read the texts and every book related to it. So to me, the course was kind of moot. But then when I did take the course, I got to see that opportunity because the person I took it with, Starhawk and Charles Williams, had a really understanding of that. We circled, we did a lot of ceremony and preparation. Of course, the room was full of very intelligent people who really knew how to garden. But of course, there was the other concepts. How do we gather? Can we feel each other's energy? Can we recognize our interconnectedness with everything? That water is not singular. So these kind of practices, when we look a little deeper, and I think that's where that language and culture for me kind of intersects. Like, what language am I using? How, when I come into a space, garden or not, am I perceiving that space? And how do I interact and create space for the others in that area? Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. It's a great point. I actually just remembered I was going to do a little bit of a shout out / request as part of the presentation. And then I forgot. But so RESES this year is collaborating with our friend Luisa's project, which is the Milpa Comunitaria de Kelowna. So the Kelowna Community Milpa project. And a milpa is like a traditional Mesoamerican planting system that will feature the three sisters, corn, beans, and squash, and many other support plants as well. And our friend Luis has been, this is now the second season that he's running this garden, and it's like by and for the local Latin American community. Anybody who like connects to these as ancestral plants is welcome to come and join. And RESES is just supporting some of the pieces of that. And so if there's anyone who's local here in Okanagan and who would like to provide donations of like garden tools or plant starts or seeds, you can let me know, because we're definitely like accepting all of those kinds of things right now. So just wanted to share that before I forgot. And I also think it's like a super cool example of like building relationships, cultural relationships to the land. I know that Luis has sourced some like heritage varieties of corn from the UBC University of British Columbia farm that he planted there, and we got to see them last year, and they're like so tall and beautiful. And I think, like, I feel like in some ways plants are kind of like languages, in the sense that they can be like super diverse and regionally specific, and then like over time, because of colonial pressures and modernization, they become less diverse. Like if you think about corn, there's like so many different varieties, or even something like potatoes, which comes from South America, or apples. There's literally thousands of varieties of these things, and they have cultural significance for the communities that originally cultivated them. But now when you go to the store, you see like 2 kinds, 3 kinds, a handful of kinds. And so I'm like seeing all these parallels between languages and cultural plants, and how like maintaining that diversity is so important on both of those levels. Any hoops. Okay, if anybody would like to say anything in closing or contribute anything else, you're welcome to do that. Otherwise, I guess we'll probably close out. So just a reminder, if you guys need to reach me, you can always reach me through the RESES website, www.reses.org. Our contact info is there, so you can always, chat. And I'm also going to be sending out a link. As long as everything goes okay with the recording of this, I will send a link to the webinar to all of you as well. So if you ever want to review it.
I'd be happy to close our circle because I'm a permaculturalist. I'm always bringing us in community. Normally I would open circle. I just didn't know the group and if it was appropriate, but I'm happy if we want to just do a mindful closing if there's no other questions. So I don't hear anybody else, maybe questions. Of course, you can always contact, I'm sure, Lucie afterwards if you had something that came to mind. I'm just going to take a second, just on our way out. Maybe we open our hands, put our feet on the ground. We're just going to relax ourselves where we are sitting in this moment in time. Maybe as a group, we just take a big breath in and a nice deep breath out. Encourage you to take 2 more of those. Just a big one in and out. One more in and out. Picture your feet or the back of your body connected to the ground, chair. And picture your feet as the tiny little roots of your tree, digging way, way deep down into the earth. Let's connect deep, deep, deep. Feeling the presence of each other and our connection to this land. Let's be here in this moment in time. In gratitude for our breath, for the wonderful presenters today, and the knowledge shared by everyone. Feel our roots deep into the earth, stretching to the center where we feel warmth. And when you're ready, let's feel that warmth in our roots, drawing it into us. On exhale. The West Coast Salish people, they use the word hinishka, and it means thank you and in gratitude. And I'd just like to thank everyone here for taking the time to come, and for Lucie and Alice for presenting, and for letting me be a part of it. Thank you so much, and a hinishka to everyone.
Thank you,
Thank
Megan.
you.
Bye, everybody. For anyone who's still in here, I just popped in because I think the recording needs to be turned off so that it will save the file. Stop recording.